Thank you very much for joining us today, Robin. And well, I'm going to introduce Robin Bronen. Is that correct? Have I pronounced it
Robin
right?
Bronen.
Bronen, sorry, Robin Bronen, and you're the executive director for the Alaska for Justice.
Yes.
Would you mind just giving me a quick rundown of your role and the role of the institute?
Sure. So we co-founded the Alaska Institute for Justice in 2005. And when we opened our office was primarily focused on providing nonprofit legal representation to immigrants and refugees who are residing in Alaska. So the Alaska Institute for Justice is the only nonprofit agency that does that work.
Okay.
Immigrants and refugees come to Alaska from all over the world. We also house a language interpreter center where we train bilingual Alaskans to work professionally as interpreters with medical, legal, and health service professionals. And then the final program is our Research and Policy Institute, and that's where all of the climate justice work that we are doing with Alaska Native tribes on the issue of climate forced displacement and relocation, that's where that work occurs.
Okay, thank you very much. What I wanted to ask, what are the more pressing issues that they're facing due to climate change?
Yeah, so because we're in the Arctic, the Arctic is warming twice as fast at a minimum as the lower latitudes. And that has caused dramatic changes to our environment. So most intensively on the north and southwest coast of Alaska, where there is permafrost. So permafrost is permanently frozen ground where the top layer in the summertime thaws, not very deep, but it thaws. Permafrost is now thawing at deeper levels, and it's thawing even in the middle of winter. So those increased temperatures are not only causing permafrost thaw, but they are also causing decreased Arctic sea ice.
Okay.
And Arctic sea ice is critical for many reasons. But one of the reasons why Arctic sea ice is so important to coastal communities in Alaska is because Arctic sea ice is the natural barrier that protects those communities along the coast from the storms that we get, which normally were in like August to the end of October, but now are August until February, where we get extreme weather events that are not hurricanes. So we don't get hurricanes yet in Alaska, but we get hurricane strength storms. And so without that Arctic sea ice protecting coasts and with the thawing of permafrost, these extreme weather events are causing what Alaska Native people call in Yupik Usteq, U-S-T-E-Q, which is catastrophic land collapse. And catastrophic land collapse is caused by the combination of flooding, erosion, and permafrost thaw. And Usteq is now causing these communities to make the awful decision that they can no longer stay in the places they call home. What it is causing are communities to make the decision about how to protect their community.
Oh, I see.
For some communities, they have made the decision that the relocation of their entire community is necessary and urgent so that they can be safe from the storms that are coming in and the thawing permafrost. So, and the challenge is, so there are 3 communities in Alaska that have that made this decision a long time ago, at least 10 to 15 to more years ago. And the 3 communities, their residents voted to relocate. and state and federal government agencies agree they need to relocate to be safe from these climate impacts, but none has been able to relocate yet because we do not have the governance structures in place to facilitate a community-wide relocation.
Yeah. What I want to also talk about was the infrastructure. I was speaking to a gentleman in Alaska the other day, and he was saying, he was giving an example that the building he was working in is completely lopsided. There seems to be a multitude of different things that are happening that perhaps is difficult to get a grip on.
Yeah, well, I think the Alaska Native communities do understand what's happening, and it is the permafrost thawing that is causing the structural integrity of their infrastructure to be altered so that you have rupturing of water lines for the communities that have running water. You have sewage lagoons being compromised because the permafrost is thawing. So, and it's one of the reasons why communities, tribes need to make decisions about how they want to adapt. And I would say one of the critical pieces to the work that we do with the Alaska Institute for Justice is making sure that the systems are decolonizing the processes that have in many ways caused these communities to face this decision. And so the heart of our work is supporting tribal sovereignty and making sure that tribes are getting the resources they need to adapt to the climate crisis in the ways that they think are best for their community.
Those challenges experienced by the Alaskan community really being recognized?
Yeah, so I would say I have been an advisory committee member of the Platform on Disaster Displacement now for a long time. And the Platform on Disaster Displacement is an international working group that includes the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration. And the heart of their work for a long time was on the cross-border movement of people. And I would say it's the experience of Alaska Natives communities that have raised the awareness of that international working group to understand that it's the internal displacement of people that is going to be the far greater crisis. And the reason why it will be the far greater crisis is because most countries in the world have no governance framework, nor do they have any desire to facilitate the internal movement of people. It is just not something that a national government in many countries has signed up to do. And part of the reason for that is because in many countries, including in the United States, the federal government forced indigenous tribes to relocate. That happened in Alaska at horrific consequence to the tribes that were forcibly relocated. And the World Bank is the most egregious entity for allowing the involuntary resettlement of people for infrastructure projects that have also tremendously harmed people and caused their further impoverishment. So we don't have the governance structures in place, and that's been recognized at the international level. It's been recognized at the national level in the United States, but there hasn't been the action required. And what I mean by that is, first of all, we're not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions enough to avert this crisis of internal population displacement for millions of people. And two, we're not really looking at what needs to change in regard to how the relocation of people within countries occurs, and make sure that their human rights are protected. And the right to self-determination is the most important human right to protect. So there are all these gaps that
Yeah.
in Alaska are causing communities to not be able to relocate as they have decided that they need to protect their communities.
Yeah, no, definitely. And do you feel that the reason why the greenhouse gases aren't being reduced emissions as much because there really is there's this confusion among a lot of people, not everyone, that there's this narrative that's been put out that climate change is a hoax. It's not real.
You know, that's part of it, but I get way more concerned about people who believe the climate crisis is happening, but aren't taking the steps necessary to change our individual lives in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say, because I've been saying this for a long time, is that it's like people who, you know, understand what's happening and have the privilege to say, it's not going to affect me. I'm going to have enough resource so that I'm going to be able to withstand whatever occurs in regard to climate impacts in my community. And that is a very false narrative, because I think we all understand that the climate is unraveling quickly in regard to like the frequency of hurricanes that happened last year in the United States. But it also puts this tremendous burden then on the communities and people who have done the least to cause this crisis. So we're not, you know, those people who understand that the climate crisis is happening and we need to do something to prevent it, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not doing enough to provide the support to communities now on the ground who need funding and technical assistance to adapt in the ways that they want to adapt.
That's right. There's this sort of attitude that I'll do something when it happens. And it's a very, like you're saying, it's a very dangerous narrative, because things are happening and people aren't recognizing. They're thinking it's over there. It just doesn't affect me. Change is hard. We all know change is hard, but it's a necessary step. I don't fully understand the permafrost.
Yeah, so I'm not a permafrost scientist.
Yeah, so I was trying to get my head around it.
I'll do my best to explain
Thank you.
permafrost. So permafrost is soil. So it's soil, as in other countries, probably composed differently, but it also includes ice. So you get the ice embedded in soil that creates the solid ground upon which infrastructure is built.
Okay.
And engineers, knowing that building infrastructure can create thawing of the permafrost and create that instability, have engineered ways to prevent that. So it's been known that building infrastructure on top of permafrost will cause the permafrost to thaw and the ground to become unsettled.
Yeah.
So, and there have been engineering solutions to that. The problem is those solutions are no longer working because the permafrost, the ice within the soil is melting at deeper levels and then not refreezing. So it's normal in our summertime for the top layer of the ground to thaw. So it can get kind of muddy in places, right? Because you've got that ice melting into the soil, so it creates muddy. But it's usually been on the very top layers. And now it's going much deeper. And then in the wintertime, it's not freezing enough at a high enough level within the soil to keep that ground solid.
Yeah, so the whole construct of the soil is breaking down. So I was told that the permafrost also holds methane gases.
Yes, well, it's definitely another contributor to the acceleration of the climate crisis, because methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas.
Oh, definitely, yes. So, Robin, so what's the way forward really for Obviously, you're doing a lot of work, a lot of legal work for the communities in Alaska. Apart from having people relocate, is there anything that's been done by the international community?
Yeah, well, it's, I think, no. I mean, the answer is no.
No.
The communities that have made the decision to relocate now, and the ones that are in a process of trying to figure out what to do, there aren't environmental, our reduction of greenhouse gas emissions now is not going to prevent that from happening, because it's happening now. And so the issue of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions substantially is to prevent, I mean, it's for lots of reasons, obviously, but in the context of this forced human mobility, it's to prevent millions more people from living in this situation where they're losing their homes and their livelihoods. And we do not yet have a plan in place of how we're going to respond to the millions. Right? We're talking about millions, hundreds of millions of people living along the coasts of the world, and where they're going to go and what we are going to do to make sure that their human rights are protected.
I know you received some grants towards the Alaskan communities. Is that in itself a recognition that more needs to be done?
Yes. So, the work that we were doing with the tribes, it has been very hard to get the funding that we need, because what we have been doing with the tribes is to create a model of what a community-led relocation process looks like, protecting the right to self-determination and other human rights. So that funding has been very hard for us to get, to create that model. It's also been almost impossible for the tribes to get the funding that they need to actually implement their relocation efforts in the 3 communities. And it's also been extremely difficult for them to get funding to protect their communities, to build the rock walls, to protect their communities, since Arctic sea ice has diminished. So funding is a huge issue, but what I would say, and we need the governance structure, so when that funding is used, it's being used in a way that's supporting the human rights of the tribes that are faced with trying to figure out how to adapt as the climate continues to change, and create additional crises in regard to their infrastructure in particular, but also impacting their health because of the sewage lagoons being compromised potentially. So yes, there are a lot more resources that are needed to address this issue.
Yeah, no, definitely. If there's one thing that you wanted people to understand about the plight of the Alaskan community, what would you like them to actually understand and think about?
It's important for people to understand that the colonization of the United States, and specifically in Alaska, caused the Alaska Native communities that are now faced with this decision to be in the places where they currently are located. So Alaska Native communities were traditionally migratory and moved to harvest the foods that they rely on. And the US federal government required community people to send their children to school. This happened over the course of the last century. And then the government and the barges transporting construction materials decided where those schools were going to be built, and told Alaska Native parents that if they didn't send their children to these schools, they would be sent to prison potentially. So the US government is the one who determined where the communities were going to become permanent settlements as opposed to migratory. and chose locations that were easy for the barge bringing the construction materials to land. And now it's these same locations that are no longer safe. Yeah. So in my mind, there's a huge responsibility that the federal government has to provide the resources to the tribes that are now faced with this decision, and that the tribes are doing everything possible to advocate for what they need to protect their community members. And the problem is not enough people are listening, and the government isn't providing the resources that are needed.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Robin. Thank you very much. That's a good food for thought for everyone to think about, because I didn't understand that, and I do understand now, because colonization has a lot to answer for across the world, and yeah, I didn't realize that. Thank you very much. I'll put your details on the website if people want to find out more about you. And yeah, thanks for giving up your time.
Thank you very much.
And you enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.